exhortation today will be provided by Brother Phil Capusta, and his title is Remember Lot. And in preparation of his remarks, he's asked us to read Genesis chapter 14. So anyone that wants to turn to that, Genesis chapter 14. It came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, kings of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemer, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth, Carnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shapher, and Kirathaim. Well, you gotta love these names here. And Horites in their Mount Seir unto El-Param, which is by the wilderness. And they returned, and they came to Mishpath, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, and dwelt in Hazazon Tamir. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite brother Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them with Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And the kings of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heavens and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. So reads chapter 14. Now we'll turn our attention to Brother Phil with his subject, Remember Lot.
Well, good morning to everyone. In Luke chapter 17, verse 32, we find a very, very short and very blunt warning coming from the lips of Jesus. It is here where Jesus says, "Remember Lot's wife." That's it. Remember Lot's wife. Very short. But I think I need to put this verse in context. So I'm going to read from Luke 17, going back to verse 28 to set the context. So, Jesus was talking about, likewise, as it was in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let him who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away, and likewise let him who is in the field not turn back. And then here's our verse. Remember Lot's wife. Today's talk has been titled, Remember Lot. It's not a misprint, it's not a misquote of Jesus' warning here in Luke 17, but rather I've chosen this truncated title, Remember Lot, because I believe we can also learn much if we stop and consider the life and actions of Lot. But the story of Lot is much more complex than the story of Lot's wife. Nonetheless, we're going to try to take a look at Lot this morning. And in the process, we will bring Abraham, or Abram, as we had his name pronounced, or his name was in Genesis 14. We will also bring Abraham into the discussion. And in a sense, I do this because Abraham also remembers Lot, and you'll see how that is true. So let's start out with the question, who was Lot? Well, Lot was the son of a man named Haran, Haran. Haran was the brother of Abraham, which meant that Lot was the nephew of Abraham. And Lot emigrated he emigrated with his grandfather. His grandfather was named Terah, from Ur the Chaldees, place where Abraham came from. They settled, interestingly, at a place named Haran, which is spelled exactly the same way in our English translation as Lot's father, Haran. What's interesting is actually in the Hebrew, it's pronounced differently, but when it's brought into English, Lot's father and the place that they immigrated to were both called Haran, Haran. So both Abraham and Lot dwelt in Haran. There, Terah died, and then Lot joined Abraham on his journey into the land of Canaan. When famine struck in Canaan, Lot joined Abraham in going down to Egypt. And later, as Lot grew rich in flocks and in possessions, a quarrel rose between Abraham's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. And in order to avoid a conflict, it was recommended that both uncle and nephew separate. Lot chose the fertile valley, the Jordan Valley, in which to settle, and eventually he extended his habitation to the city of Sodom. And this brings us up to Genesis 14, which our brother read for us this morning. And I'm going to spend most of the time this morning in Genesis 14. Now here we can see Abraham's dwelling place would have been over here in Hebron, and where it's believed Sodom may have been. And the Dead Sea above that was interesting. I didn't realize this until I started studying. The Dead Sea has actually grown over time, although recently it's been shrinking. But prior to, they believe, at least one particular Bible archaeologist believes that the Dead Sea region expanded when the destruction on Sodom occurred. Anyway, there's a map to kind of get you a better idea of the geographical places that we're talking about here. So what we find in Genesis 14 is a confederation of kings who fight a battle against another confederation of kings. The losers of the battle included the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And these latter kings were put under tribute to the victors. After 12 years, which essentially amounted to paying taxes to the victors, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah decided, hey, we've had enough, and they rebelled. This rebellion then caused the original victors to once more enter into battle with their former foes, and like the first battle, the same confederation of kings was victorious for a second time. This time, however, the vanquished were taught a lesson. The vanquished were plundered, and many of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were taken captive. And we read this in Genesis 14, verse 11. So the enemy took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. And verse 12 goes on to tell us that Lot and his possessions Lot and his possessions were among the things that the victorious kings carried away as booty. Verse 12 says they also took Lot, the son of Abraham's or Abram's brother, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Now, although verses 11 and 12 do not state or indicate that anyone else in Lot's family had been taken away, we do find later on in verse 16 that others in Lot's family were taken captive. So here's the picture. Lot is now a captive, and it's quite a change of fortune for a person who at one time followed Abraham into the land of promise, who was given the choice to go anywhere he wished with Abraham's blessing. Remember, no one forced Lot to move to Sodom. It was his own choice. Lot chose to become a dweller of Sodom, a city which I said earlier was in rebellion, or who rebelled against the confederation of strong kings. The same man, Lot, who was rich in possessions, is now a captive, and his possessions have been taken violently from him. So, what happened after that? Well, Abraham learned that his nephew Lot had been taken captive, and Abraham responded immediately, arming his servants with weapons of war. And then he went out in hot pursuit to rescue Lot. And there you could say Abraham remembered Lot. We read about this then in verses 15 and 16. And he, Abraham, divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and routed them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his goods, and the women, and the people. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's good news. That's wonderful. Lot, he's been rescued along with his family and his possessions. Hurrah, hurrah. Way to go, Abraham. Well, I guess that would be a normal reaction, which is also kind of reinforced by what happens next. So what we have next occur is a figure named Melchizedek comes out to welcome Abraham and his army when they return back from the defeat of the invading kings. And here in verse 18, we see that. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So I want to make it clear, I do not deny the fact that God's hand was involved in the victory by Abraham over the invading army. I don't deny that God was at work here. God delivered the enemies of Abraham into, or I say the enemies, into the hand of Abraham. And that's how Melchizedek describes it. But let me ask some hard questions at this point. Does this mean that what Abraham did was right when he went to war for the sake of his loved one, that is, his nephew Lot. Think about it. What Abraham did in arming his servants and pursuing after the aggressors, was this a wise thing to do? Was this what God wanted? When Abraham remembered Lot, did Abraham make a mistake in his response? Was Abraham's decision to go to war and pursue after the enemies of the confederation of the kings the wrong thing to do? So some of these are the questions I want you to think about, and we're going to tackle this morning. And you'll see the relevance here with time. So I will acknowledge Abraham, he is called the father of the faithful by many. But being called the father of the faithful does not make you perfect. So when you consider some of the questions I just brought forward, please consider that Abraham was not perfect. He had made errors and would go on to make errors. For example, in 2 chapters before this, Genesis 12, we read about Abram and Sarai going down to Egypt during a famine. And before entering Egypt, he told his wife to not reveal that she was his wife. Rather, she was to pretend to be Abraham's sister. Now, once the secret was revealed or came to light to Pharaoh, of all people, king of Egypt, Abraham was forced to leave Egypt essentially with his tail between his legs. Not a very good set of choices by Abraham. Then in Genesis 16, Abraham hearkens to the suggestion of his wife Sarah that he take Hagar and have a child by her, Hagar being Sarah's servant. This too was a major mistake on Abraham's part. Then in Genesis 20, Abraham told a half-truth, again going back to his modus operandi, when he went to Egypt before, he now told his wife for a second time, keep it secret, you're my sister. Got it? And he did this because he feared for his life when he ventured into the land of Abimelech. Once again, Abraham was embarrassed and rebuked by the king after the truth came to light. In each of these events, yes, God intervened. I don't deny that. God intervened in the life of Abraham. But does God's intervention, it doesn't change the fact that Abraham had made 3 bad decisions in all the instances I just recounted for you. And just because the hand of God delivers a person from the error of his ways does not mean that God approves of that error. Now, I want you to consider all this and what comes next with respect to Abraham when I suggest to you that Abraham made a mistake in forming an army and pursuing after the invading kings who had taken his nephew captive and carried off his possessions. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would I even find these questions worth asking and studying? Why would I bother questioning whether God approved of Abraham's decision to form an army and forcibly attempt to rescue Lot, his family, and his possessions? Well, there's an interesting backstory to this. I was recently asked to address this matter, this specific matter, in light of our community's stance as conscientious objectors. I was asked as to whether Abraham's actions here in Genesis 14 can be used to justify the use of violence by a Christian, one who follows the teachings of Jesus. And the logic behind the question that was raised or asked to me is this. If Abraham, the friend of God, the father of the faithful, If he could form an army and go out and slaughter a confederation of kings, well then why can't we do something similar, since we have the same faith as Abraham in the promises of God? Why can't we likewise use armed force to protect our possessions and our loved ones? Why can't we be part of an army that seeks to do nothing more than defend our home and loved ones and our possessions? So I hope you see there is a practical side to the matter that I'm bringing before you this morning. Now, I had earlier suggested to you that despite what at first appeared to be a positive outcome to Abraham's slaughter of the kings, I feel that Abraham, in fact, made a mistake. And I want to present my case here before you. My next piece of evidence comes from the fact that there is no record of Abraham praying to God for guidance when the news reached him of the capture of Lot. Nowhere in the story do we find Abraham asking God for direction or guidance. Instead, in Genesis 14, verse 14, we read this: "When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan." Now contrast the actions of Abraham here with those of David when a similar event occurred in the life of David. If you remember in 1 Samuel chapter 30, starting at verse 8, we find David responding to an Amalekite raid upon a city where he had left two of his wives in safekeeping. And when David was away, the Amalekites attacked the city, burned it, took all the women and children and its goods. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? And when David learned the news, he asked the Lord, "Should I chase the people who took our families? Will I catch them?" The Lord answered, "Chase them, you will catch them, and you will succeed in saving your families." And this is not the only time that David sought an answer from God prior to taking up the sword. There are 4 other instances where David asked God what he should do, whether to enter into battle or to forbear. And I've got the references up here on the screen. And David wasn't alone. Other kings, such as Saul and Jehoshaphat, did the same prior to entering into war. And yet, when we look back at Genesis 14, with respect to Abraham, we find no such inquiry made by Abraham prior to setting out with an army to rescue Lot. So I present this as an important piece of evidence in my case that Abraham here made a major mistake. Now my next point would be to argue, or at least I should say what I would do next in my second piece of evidence, is show what happened after Abraham's defeat of the kings and his rescue of his nephew Lot. So I ask you, what happened after the dust settled? And after Melchizedek blessed Abraham, what happened after that? Well, Abraham returned home to the Oaks of Mamre. You saw it on the screen here. Well, it was. To the east, back into Canaan. But what happened, and what did Lot do next? Interestingly, Lot returned, not so interestingly, Lot returned to his home, but what's so interesting is Lot's home was Sodom. So Lot returns to Sodom. Just let that sink in for a moment. Lot returned to Sodom. This is the same Sodom that God would destroy by fire and brimstone several years later. This is the same Sodom that in Genesis 18, God would say, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry which has come to me." Now, I would suggest that the state of moral depravity in Sodom wasn't something that Sodom had suddenly slid into after Lot returned home. And I would actually be able to support that. Because back in Genesis 13, we find this. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against Yahweh. So think back to when Lot's herdsmen were disputing with Abraham's herdsmen, and remember, Lot chose to separate and move towards Sodom. Not only did Lot choose to make sinful Sodom his home back then, which is bad enough, but Lot now chose for a second time to make Sodom his home after Abraham had rescued him as a captive. And honestly, this is very remarkable. It's very sad, and leaves you dumbfounded, leaves me dumbfounded. Despite Sodom's long-standing reputation as an exceedingly wicked and sinful city, Lot chose to make this city his home. Twice Lot chose to make sinful Sodom his home. Let this sink in. But let's flip back to Abraham right now. I want you to consider something else. In Genesis chapter 18, remember 3 angels, 3 men, they're often described, come from God to visit Abraham. They are there to inform Abraham that he will have a son by Sarah. At the end of that meeting, Abraham learned that God was going to destroy Sodom. The very city, remember, the very city that Abraham had rescued out of the jaws of the lion, so to speak. Imagine the embarrassment on Abraham's part when he realized that he had preserved a city that God had marked out for destruction. Abraham knew of Sodom's state in the eyes of God, otherwise he would not have felt it necessary to keep lowering the number when he asked God to spare the city. Remember the dialogue between Abraham and the one. Surely you wouldn't destroy the city if 50 righteous could be found therein. No, make that 45. No, 40. Sorry, I actually meant 30. No, I meant 20. Well, how about 10? You don't bargain in that manner if you are confident Sodom has a remnant worth saving, other than your nephew Lot and his family. The very fact that Abraham kept lowering the number tells you that Abraham knew the condition of the city. As it turned out, there were less than 10 righteous individuals in Sodom, the city that Abraham preserved when he went out against the Confederation of Kings. Okay, so what am I getting at? Well, consider the possibility that the defeat of Sodom by the Confederated Kings may have in fact been God's judgment against that exceedingly wicked and sinful city. And in rescuing his nephew Lot through the use of a homemade army, Abraham at the same time rescued the other captives of Sodom. Abraham rescued those who God had earlier described as wicked and great sinners. Do you think that was a good idea on the part of Abraham? But let's go even further with some more hard questions. We all know that Sodom was eventually destroyed by fire. It was destroyed after Lot and part of his family were dragged out of the city by their hands, pulled out of the city by 2 angels. We know the story of what happened to Lot's wife. She turned to a pillar of salt and she died when she looked back. Then Lot and his 2 daughters fled to the hills to a city named Zoar. But what happened after that? Well, for the sake of decency, I'm going to skip over the details and jump to the scandalous result, which is Lot's 2 daughters each gave birth to a son. One of the sons was named Moab, from whom came the Moabites. The other son was named Ben-Ami, from whom came the Ammonites. So, put on your thinking caps. What happened to the Moabites and to the Ammonites? Here's a picture of the regions in which the Ammonites and the Moabites settled. To the east of the Jordan River. Well, here's the answer as to what happened to them. First, starting with the Ammonites. Throughout the Bible, the Ammonites and the Israelites are portrayed as mutual antagonists. During the Exodus, the Israelites were prohibited by the Ammonites from passing through their lands. The Ammonites allied themselves with Eglon, king of the Moabites, in attacking Israel. During the days of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, the Ammonites and the Moabites formed a coalition against Jehoshaphat. The Ammonites eventually became subjects to Assyria, and yet their hostility to Judah is shown in their joining with the Chaldeans to destroy Jerusalem. You can see 2 Kings 24 on that. The cruelty of the Ammonites is denounced by the prophet Amos. See Amos 1:13. The Ammonites, it was prophesied they would be destroyed by Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 49. The same thing is prophesied by Ezekiel, see Ezekiel 21. Zechariah says the same thing, the destruction of the Ammonites in Zechariah 2, verses 8 and 9. Interesting, I didn't realize this. The Ammonites were responsible for the murder of Gedaliah, who was the governor that was put in charge of Judah after Jerusalem fell at the hand of the Babylonians. And I didn't realize this next fact either until I started studying. Tobiah was an Ammonite, and who was Tobiah? He was united with Sanballat against Nehemiah. You can see that in Nehemiah chapter 4. And they both opposed the Jews in their attempt to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And even the opposition to the Jews continued outside the pages of the Old Testament because we, in history, find out that the Ammonites joined the Syrians in their wars against the Jewish Maccabees, but they were eventually defeated by Judas Maccabee. So that's the history of the Ammonites. I mean, it's a lot there. I just wanted to show you where the Ammonites went after the birth of Ammon, or Ben-Ami. So now we'll look at the other son that was born to Lot's daughter, the Moabites. Now, interesting, they weren't as much a thorn in the side of Israel as the Ammonites, but they still were a thorn. And honestly, there's nothing that good that came out of Moab except for Ruth. And with time, the Moabites, they become a vassal to the northern tribes of Israel, but they did join with Israel to attack the southern kingdom of Judah. That did not turn out very well for the Moabites or to Israel. We read in Isaiah chapter 15 and 16 how the Moabites are mentioned as being prideful. Same thing in Jeremiah 48, Ezekiel 25. And consequently, the Moabites were carried away captive into Babylon. And pretty much the Moabites disappear from the pages of history after the fall of Babylon. There's one verse related to this I wanted to share with you in Jeremiah 48:47, where we read, "Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, says the Lord." And these latter days are believed to be the Messianic age. But as far as I know, the Moabites have disappeared in the 6th century with the Persian Empire. So, a little bit dry, I realize that. But this is the history of the children of Lot. And you can sum up pretty much the history of the Ammonites and the Moabites with one verse in Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 8. I have heard the taunts of Moab and the revilings of the Ammonites, how they have taunted my people and made boasts against their territory. And there's something similar to this that you read in Psalm 83, an interesting reference to the children of Lot, where both Ammon and Moab are mentioned along with other nations that join together in their cry to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. I'm going to read a portion of this here in Psalm 83. O God, do not keep silence, do not hold thy peace, or be still, O God. For lo, thy enemies are in tumult. Those who hate thee have raised their heads. They lay crafty plans against thy people. They consult together against thy protected ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. Interesting in light of current events today in the Middle East. Yea, they conspire with one accord against thee. They make a covenant. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagarites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia, with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria also has joined them. They are the strong arm of the children of Lot. A lot of these territories you find today, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iran. Interesting in light of current events how Psalm 83 is playing out. Some believe, therefore, that the psalm actually will have a double fulfillment in the latter days, or in other words, in our time. So, in summary, with the exception of Ruth the Moabitess, nothing much good came from the Ammonites or the Moabites. Their history is pretty much that of being thorns in the side of Israel and Judah. So, at this point, I'd like to return back to my original argument, which is, I believe that Abraham made a mistake when he remembered Lot. That is, when Abraham rescued his nephew through the use or the formation of an army and the use of violence. Other than receiving a blessing from Melchizedek and the entrance of Ruth into the lineage of David, it's hard to argue that Abraham's use of force was wise. I do not, therefore, see Abraham's slaughter of the kings, as is referred to, as an example for the followers of Jesus. So let's recount the outcome of Abraham's actions. They are, 1, Lot returned back to that exceedingly wicked and sinful city of Sodom in order to increase his wealth and political standing in the city. 2, the city of Sodom was destroyed by God. 3, Lot lost his wife. 4, his 2 daughters committed an unspeakable indecency. 5, Lot's descendants became a thorn or thorns in the side of Israel and Judah, and continue to be so this very day if we see Psalm 83 playing out before us in the Middle East. Take all those things, put them together, and I would argue that this is not something I would call a positive outcome, looking at things from a long-term perspective. And this is really at the heart of this investigation and this exhortation, and where I'd like to make this personal for us. In our lives, we can make snap decisions which, in the short term, we can make snap decisions which in the short term appear to result in a positive outcome. And the question in all this is, where is God and where is his word in the major decisions in our lives? Do we seek the face of God And do we use his word to guide our steps when we are confronted with important decisions in our lives? In Proverbs chapter 20, verse 18, we are told, plans are established by counsel, by wise guidance, wage war. But, question, did Abraham follow this model? It would appear that he did not. So I ask, do we, like Abraham's decision, that is Abraham's decision to rescue his nephew Lot through the use of an army, do we make quick decisions on our own without first taking time to ask God's counsel and guidance? Or do we do what is right in our own sight with a little thought about the potential long-term consequences of our decisions? As we have seen with respect to Abraham's decision to go to war, just because a decision at first appears to have turned out well, that doesn't mean that that decision was the right one. Therefore, I say to you, let's not only remember Lot's wife, but let's remember Lot's life. Do you think that Lot's first and second decisions to make Sodom his home were the result of Lot seeking guidance from God? Initially, Lot's decisions seemed to produce a good outcome for Lot. Lot, he grew wealthy. He rose to prominence within Sodom. From a worldly perspective, that seems like a good thing. The American dream, as some might put it. But as we have seen, in the long term, they were disastrous decisions for him and his family, and who knows, countless others. Our decisions to major life choices may seem to be in step with the society around us, but are they in step with God's will and his word? Consider the matters of where we choose to live, what we do for a living, how we raise our children, where we go to school, or where we send our children for their education, what friends we make, what people we date, who we marry, whether we participate in the military or the political institutions of our society, or even within the smaller, mundane aspects of our lives, which over time become major habits or attitudes in our lives, such as what we do with our money, what we do with our free time, what kind of entertainment do we consume, etc., etc., etc. In all of these things, is God at the forefront in all of these choices? Do we stop to consider what God would think about our responses to these choices? How often do we pray over these choices, if at all? So yes, I agree with Jesus when he warned us, remember Lot's wife. But I would exhort us to go even further. Let's not only remember Lot's wife, as Jesus said, but also remember Lot's life. And I close this exhortation with one more proverb. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Thank you for your attention.